The Indian subcontinent has a long and complex history of cultural and religious diversity. For centuries, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians lived side by side, often in relative harmony. However, the events surrounding the partition of India in 1947 led to unprecedented violence and suffering. This video examines how these communities, once coexisting, became embroiled in a conflict that resulted in the deaths of over 2 million people and the sexual assault of thousands of women. To understand this transformation, we must look back at the history of the region. The Indian subcontinent has been home to various religious and cultural groups for millennia. Hinduism, one of the world's oldest religions, originated in the region. Buddhism emerged in the 5th century BCE. Islam arrived through trade and conquest, beginning in the 8th century CE. Sikhism developed in the Punjab region in the 15th century. Christianity has had a presence since ancient times, with significant growth during the colonial era. For much of history, these diverse communities often lived together peacefully, with periods of tension and conflict, but also long stretches of coexistence and cultural exchange. Rulers of various faiths governed multi-religious populations, sometimes with tolerance, other times with discrimination. The Mughal Empire, for instance, saw both periods of religious accommodation and instances of intolerance. The arrival of European colonial powers, particularly the British, brought significant changes to the social and political landscape. The British East India Company and later the British Raj implemented policies that often exacerbated existing divisions. The strategy of divide and rule played a crucial role in deepening religious and communal rifts. One key factor was the introduction of separate electorates based on religious identity in the early 20th century. This system, while intended to protect minority rights, had the effect of solidifying religious identities in the political sphere. Census categorization and other administrative practices further reinforced these divisions. As the independence movement gained momentum in the early 20th century, different visions for the future of the subcontinent emerged. Some leaders like Mahatma Gandhi advocated for a unified, secular India. Others, including Muhammad Ali Jinnah, argued for separate nations based on religious majorities. The idea of Pakistan as a separate Muslim homeland gained traction in the 1930s and 1940s. Meanwhile, communal tensions increased, with riots occurring in various parts of the subcontinent. The political negotiations for independence became increasingly fraught, with the British government ultimately deciding on partition as a solution. The announcement of partition in 1947 triggered massive population movements. Millions of Muslims moved to Pakistan, while millions of Hindus and Sikhs moved to India. This massive displacement, coupled with long-standing tensions and the sudden collapse of colonial authority, led to outbreaks of horrific violence. Communities that had lived together for generations suddenly turned on each other. The reasons were complex, involving fear, revenge, opportunism, and the breakdown of law and order. The violence was not one-sided. Atrocities were committed by and against all communities involved. The scale of the tragedy was immense. Conservative estimates suggest that over 2 million people lost their lives. Thousands of women were abducted and sexually assaulted. Families were torn apart, and entire communities were uprooted. The trauma of partition continues to affect relations between India and Pakistan to this day. It's important to note that this violence was not the inevitable result of centuries-old hatred. Rather, it was the culmination of a complex set of historical, political, and social factors. The speed and manner of the British withdrawal, the lack of preparation for maintaining law and order during the transition, and the inflammatory rhetoric of some political and religious leaders all contributed to the chaos. The question of whether these communities were forced to live together or if hatred always existed between them is complex. Historical evidence suggests that for much of history, coexistence was the norm rather than the exception. Intermarriage, cultural exchange, and shared traditions were common. However, periods of conflict and tension also existed, often exacerbated by political and economic factors. The notion that Muslims were entirely foreign to the subcontinent or that Hindus were the original inhabitants is an oversimplification. The Indian subcontinent has seen waves of migration and cultural exchange for thousands of years. Many Muslims in the region were converts from other faiths, while Hinduism itself evolved over centuries, incorporating various traditions. Similarly, the idea of a homogeneous Hindu or Muslim community is ahistorical. Both groups encompass diverse ethnic, linguistic, and cultural subgroups. The concept of religious nationalism, which played a significant role in the partition, was largely a modern development influenced by colonial policies and emerging political ideologies. It's also worth noting that the violence of partition was not representative of the entire population. Many people on both sides of the newly drawn borders risked their lives to protect members of other communities. There are numerous stories of Hindus sheltering Muslims, Muslims protecting Sikhs, and so on. In the aftermath of partition, both India and Pakistan have grappled with the challenges of building pluralistic societies. India adopted a secular constitution, while Pakistan initially aimed for a more Islamic state, though with protections for minorities. Both countries have faced ongoing challenges in managing diversity and communal relations. The legacy of partition continues to shape the geopolitics of South Asia. The Kashmir conflict, nuclear proliferation, and periodic tensions between India and Pakistan can all be traced back to the events of 1947. At the same time, there have been efforts at reconciliation and people-to-people contact between the two countries. Understanding this history is crucial for fostering peace and cooperation in the region. It's important to recognize that the violence of partition was not the result of inherent incompatibility between religious groups, but rather a tragic outcome of complex historical and political factors. Today, millions of people in South Asia and around the world continue to work towards interfaith harmony and cross-cultural understanding. Many recognize that the diverse heritage of the subcontinent is a source of strength rather than division. In conclusion, the transformation of coexisting communities into antagonists during partition was not inevitable or based on age-old hatreds. It was the result of a complex interplay of colonial policies, political maneuvering, economic factors, and the chaos of rapid decolonization. By understanding this history in all its complexity, we can work towards a future of greater understanding and cooperation among all communities.